I'm always looking for that perfect carry-everywhere camera, the one that's noticeably better than my phone in quality, but is small and cheap enough that I want to carry it around. Today's contender is the Sony RX1, a full-frame 24-megapixel camera with a 35mm f2 Zeiss Sonnar lens. The only catch is it was released in 2012, so it has some minor technical limitations that sort of counteract the amazing image quality a little bit. But can you still use it as an everyday camera today? This camera has a full-frame sensor despite being smaller than cameras like the APS-C Fujifilm X100 VI. As well as being small, it only weighs 482 grams, which at the time made it the smallest and lightest full-frame camera you could buy. While we're talking about size, the lens does protrude out a little bit more than I'd prefer compared to something like the Fujifilm X100s. And it's still much bigger than some of my favourite compact cameras like the Panasonic GM1 and GM5, although they are micro four thirds. By the way, they did bring out a slight update to this camera in the RX1R, which is exactly the same as the RX1, only they removed the anti-aliasing filter to add some sharpness. Some of the most obvious downsides to the RX1 are there is no EVF built in, no tilting screen, and no phase detect autofocus. More on that one in a moment. And all of these features were then fixed in the Mark II version of this camera, the RX1R Mark II. Great name. And they also added in a 42 megapixel sensor, the one that was featured in the A7R II. The problem with the RX1R Mark II is, despite being a camera from 2015, it still goes for £2,000 secondhand online, if not more sometimes. And I just can't justify spending that much money on a second-hand old carry-around camera. Price-wise, the RX1, the original one, is around the £600 to £800 mark second-hand, and that's the only way you can buy it because it's so old. And that does make it slightly more affordable, obviously, than the RX1R Mark II, but it also does bring it into the price range of some much newer, excellent fixed-lens cameras. Mentioning newer, more modern cameras brings me on to the biggest negative, I would say, for the RX1, which is its autofocus. The camera has a front switch allowing you to change between autofocus, direct manual focus, and fully manual focus. I set the custom button on top to autofocus area so I can switch between multi, center, and flexible spot. Once you're on flexible spot, there is no touchscreen to move around the focus point on this camera, and there is also no joystick to move it around either. To move it, you have to hit the center button and then use the D-pad left, right, up or down to move your focus point, which I find usable if a little bit clumsy. The autofocus itself it's just okay. It's contrast based and it's from 2012. And I'm sure it wasn't bad when it was released, but for me it often misses its mark, especially in low light. It can't continuously track either, and it does feel particularly sluggish when you compare it to much more modern cameras like, for example, the Sony A7 III. Of course, Sony knew this, and that's why they added much better phase detect in the Mark II version of this camera, but that doesn't help me, I've got the Mark I version. So one workaround for the autofocus is setting the AEL button to be an AF/MF hold button, and that way you can get your focus, hold that button, and then it won't change the focus every time you want to snap a shot, and I found this quite useful when snapping pictures of my daughter. However, if you can live with the slower focusing, for example if you do landscape photography and you don't need to photograph a toddler that seems to move at the speed of light, then there are plenty of other positives worth considering. This is a fixed lens camera, which makes it all the better that they included an excellent 35mm f2 from Zeiss. On the lens it has a macro shift allowing you to focus down to 0.2 meters, an aperture ring with clicks which feel really nice high quality. This coupled with the back dial which allows you to change your shutter speed means that you have all the controls you'd expect from a full-size camera. The Zeiss lens is an f2, which makes it excellent on this full-frame sensor at blurring out the background and really isolating your subject. Of course, to take advantage of that lovely f2 blurry background, you're going to need a fast shutter in bright light, and unfortunately, here's another downside. At the f2 setting, Sony's leaf shutter can only hit a maximum 1/2000th of a second, and it only goes up to 1/4000th once you make it to f5.6. On bright days, that means it's not quite dark enough at the f2 mode and on 1/2000th of a second to sort of bring down the exposure to the correct value. You can sort of get away with it because the sensor has a lot of latitude, so if you're using raw files, you can bring that down in post. However, I don't like doing that because sometimes it just does look a little bit too bright, and I want the confidence to know that I've definitely exposed it right in camera. Because I don't want to risk that, the only other option to bring down the light that's entering the camera is an ND filter, but I also don't want to carry around an ND filter with me on the front of the camera all the time, especially if I'm going from indoors and outdoors with it, because it is a small portable camera I'm going to take everywhere. I know what you're going to say, not everything's about blurry backgrounds. Yeah, I know. And to be fair, the full frame sensor on this, especially when you stop down to something like f5.6, does give you super sharp images with great image quality. However, at f2, fully wide open, the background blur definitely has a bit more character to it, and it just looks super smooth and nice, and it would have been nice to be able to use that all the time in bright light without any limitations. Just to reiterate, I really do like the lens on this camera, and I think it's part of the reason why you might get this camera, because it's a Zeiss Sonnar f2 lens. And whilst we're on to more positives with the camera, the build quality is excellent. It's a really solid metal build, and it's one of those cameras that does make you want to just pick it up and use it over something like a smartphone. And I think that's one of the main reasons for sort of diving down into a lot of these older cameras. I just want to find something that I want to use and is enjoyable to use as a sort of hobby camera. The Sony does have a little pop-up flash, which is great to use as a little fill flash when you're outdoors, or like a lot of people are doing nowadays, using it indoors to get that sort of direct, instant flash look. Compared to my GM1, however, it doesn't angle, so you could angle and bounce up the GM1, but the mechanism on the Sony only allows it to come out and in, it doesn't tilt upwards. Another key feature I like that a lot of older cameras sometimes don't offer is customizing the buttons, and the Sony allows you to customize a handful of buttons, and it also has an exposure compensation dial on the top, which is really handy. Being an older camera, some of the ports are slightly outdated, however, you can still use them. You've got the micro HDMI, I probably won't use that, but it's there. You have a micro USB, which allows you to charge the battery in the camera, which is actually quite useful for an older camera, and you also have a mic jack, and that can be used for the video. Now, although I do video for my job, I didn't buy this as a video camera at all, really. I bought it as a photography camera first, and that's the great thing about a lot of these older cameras, is their photography and image quality is still pretty close to what you can get nowadays. However, because of the improvement in processors and such that are put into newer cameras, the video quality has moved on quite a lot. So here's a quick sample of what the video looks like. Here is a test of the video quality. This is just using the inbuilt mic because I can't figure out any way of turning down the mic levels when I use an external mic plugged into the mic jack that I said was useful. This is the video quality. This is autofocus, so I might not be in focus. The shutter release has a little screw mount, so you can attach a screw shutter release, or more likely, what a lot of people do with the Fuji cameras that also have this feature, is screw in a coloured button to make it a bit easier to press the shutter. One really cool thing about this camera is the lens cap. Now I know what you're thinking, that's not cool. It is though, because it's fully metal, and for some reason it just makes you want to take it off the camera. It's ergonomically designed that way, and it's just so much nicer to use than all the cheap plastic lens caps where you have to sort of grip from the side and get it off the lens. I just hate using those lens caps, and for some reason I really like this one. Despite me absolutely loving that lens cap, there is one thing it didn't distract me from, and that's the battery life, which is average to poor. It's only rated at 220 shots, and I would say it's probably less than that, and it uses the Sony NP-BX1 battery. The good thing about this is that's been around for so long and is used in so many cameras and camcorders that you can get cheap third-party ones off Amazon fairly easily. And like a lot of the older Sony cameras, the screens on these are susceptible to having the anti-reflective coating just sort of slowly degrade and wear away with time. Luckily mine had a screen protector put on at some stage, which has sort of saved it from this fate. But if you look in second hand for this camera, you'll find that a lot of them have that issue. So to keep or not to keep, that is the question. It really confuses me why Sony haven't brought out a newer version of this camera, especially with the runaway success of cameras like the Fuji X100 line, especially the number 5 and 6 models, which have been out of stock constantly, and cameras like the Panasonic S9 that recently came out, which is trying to take some of that market with a full frame sensor. I feel like this would be the perfect full frame compact to sort of join in that battle. So far, my process for this camera has been to take it out, use it, try and get focus on most of the shots and miss them, but then load it up in Lightroom and find the 1 or 2 shots that I did manage to get in focus look really good and are excellent quality. In fact, I've printed out a couple from this camera and I'm really happy with the print quality. Hopefully Sony bring out a Mark III version of this camera and add a really fast electronic shutter, which means I can shoot full f2 wide open blurry backgrounds until the cows come home. Or at least to allow the Mark II to come down in price finally.